The American Revolution had both long-term origins and short-term causes. In this section, we will look broadly at some of the long-term political, intellectual, cultural, and economic developments in the 18th century that set the context for the crisis of the 1760s and 1770s. Okay, so let's begin with how Britain went from ignoring the colonies to attempting to control them. Between the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the middle of the 18th century, Britain had largely failed to define the colonies' relationship to the empire and institute a coherent program of imperial reform. Two factors contributed to these failures. First, Britain was at war from the War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the century through the 7 Years' War in 1763. Constant war was politically consuming and economically expensive. Second, competing visions of empire divided British officials. Old Whigs and their Tory supporters envisioned an authoritarian empire based on conquering territory and extracting resources. They sought to eliminate Britain's growing national debt by raising taxes and cutting spending on the colonies. The radical or patriot Whigs based their imperial vision on trade and manufacturing instead of land and resources. They argued that economic growth, not raising taxes, would solve the national debt. Instead of an authoritarian empire, Patriot Whigs argued that the colonies should have equal status with the mother country. There were occasional attempts to reform the administration of the colonies, but debate between the two sides prevented coherent reform. Second, during this period, colonists developed their own understanding of how they fit into the empire. They saw themselves as British subjects entitled to all the natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights of our fellow subjects. The 18th century brought significant economic and demographic growth in the colonies. This success, they believed, resulted partly from Britain's hands-off approach to the colonies, an approach that has been called salutary neglect. By mid-century, colonists believed that they held a special place in the empire that justified Britain's hands-off policy. In 1764, James Otis Jr. wrote, "The colonists are entitled to as ample rights, liberty, and privileges as the subjects of the mother country are, and in some respects too, more." Third, in this same period, the colonies developed their own local political institutions. Samuel Adams, in the Boston Gazette, described the colonies as each being a separate body politic from Britain. Almost immediately, upon each colony's settlement, they created a colonial assembly. These assemblies assumed many of the same duties as the commons exercised in Britain, including taxing residents, managing the spending of the colony's revenue, and granting salaries to royal officials. In the early 1700s, colonial leaders unsuccessfully lobbied the British government to define their assembly's legal prerogatives, but Britain was too occupied with European wars. In the first half of the 18th century, royal governors tasked by the Board of Trade attempted to limit the power of the assemblies, but the assembly's power only grew. Many colonists came to see their assemblies as having the same jurisdiction over them that Parliament exercised over those in England. They interpreted British inaction as justifying their tradition of local governance. The Crown and Parliament, however, disagreed. Fourth, political culture in the colonies also developed differently than that of the mother country. In both Britain and the colonies, land was the key to political participation, but because land was more easily obtained in the colonies, a higher proportion of male colonists participated in politics. Colonial political culture drew inspiration from the Country Party in Britain. These ideas, generally referred to as the ideology of republicanism, stressed the corrupting nature of power, and the need for those involved in self-governing to be patriots would need to be ever vigilant against the rise of conspiracies, centralized control, and tyranny. Only a small fringe in Britain held these ideas, but in the colonies, they were widely accepted. Finally, remember that in the 1740s, perhaps no single philosopher had a greater impact on colonial thinking than John Locke. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke argued that the mind was originally a tabula rasa, and that individuals were formed primarily by their environment. The aristocracy then were wealthy or successful because they had greater access to wealth, education, and patronage, and not because they were innately superior.